Scott Lucas, and this is World Unfiltered. Thank you very much for joining us today for a discussion where I'm going to be a student, and I think all of you will be as well, and we're going to learn from Professor Zeynep Alemdar about feminist foreign policy. One of the most important concepts in our 21st century world as we're trying to negotiate all these crises, all these conflicts, but also looking for possibilities and for opportunities. Is a feminist foreign policy a way that we can learn from, not just in Turkey, not just in the UK, not just in the United States, but in a world unfiltered? Professor Alemdar is a full professor of political science and international relations at Okan University in Istanbul. There, she heads up the Faculty of Business and Administrative Sciences and also the Gender Studies Research Center. But she is very much a scholar of the world, an international scholar. She has served on the editorial boards of International Studies Perspective, Turkish Policy Quarterly. She's taught international politics as well as gender and politics and women's movements. She's a visiting professor at the Center for Turkish Studies in the Hatfield School of Government at Portland State University in the US. She's been one of the 4 leaders under 40 for the Next Generation Leaders Program for the Euro-Atlantic Security Initiative at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. She has been awarded the Next Generation Hurford Fellowship, where she spent her sabbatical. But there's also an international connection, which kind of makes it special for me to be able to chat with her. And that is her doctorate in political science is from the University of Kentucky in the beautiful city of Lexington, Kentucky, which is where my mother and my aunt also did their education at UK. So a big Kentucky welcome to Professor Alemdar with this note that she has experience and she is a leader in talking about what gender equality might mean. Gender equality in Turkey, working with public and private actors and with international organizations, UNWomen, World Bank, and the European Union and civil society groups. And what really spurred me to want to talk to her today is she's the founder and director of the Women in Foreign Policy Initiative in Turkey. So let's find out a bit more. Professor Alemdar, thank you so much for coming on World Unfiltered. I want to start with a basic question, which is just, what is a feminist foreign policy?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this, very lengthy welcome. I'm kind of flattered and humbled by everything you said about me. They are true, but, we women are usually not used to, being read long biographies mostly. So what is feminist foreign policy? It is basically, it's a shootout. It's a challenge to the traditional international relations theories. So what feminist IR theorists are trying to do is actually to challenge the language, the structure, and of the traditional international relations, and also question, right, and ask the very apt question of who wrote this, who wrote this IR, and who are the actors, and why are women so few in this whole international relations world? So what we are trying to do is, first we challenge the language, all this language that comes with power, anarchy, hierarchy, borders, sovereignty. They're all related. They're all terms that are related with to men mostly. This objectivity, this this power. So all these concepts are very much male concepts that usually are not, in our communal understanding of what gender is, are not usually, considered female, let's say. So they're all concepts that are related to man and what, how man should be in the, in the community. Then we challenge, the structure of this whole international relations and how we study it. We divide the domestic and the international. We divide the, national and the international. And usually, domestic is in the house, where women work, and international is outside the house where men work. So, this distinction between the domestic and the international, the national and the foreign, is usually divides us again. Whereas, women are also subject to international policy and international policies effects. And then we also ask about, what is this difference between soft and hard politics? Where does the soft and hard come from, So we also challenge this hierarchical nature, where do you start? Like, is COVID less important than nuclear war? We saw that, all of us are cooped up in our homes for the past, almost a year now. And apparently health is as important as, nuclear weapons. So, and it affects the economy as well. So these types of questions that, feminist international scholars ask, and we say that it is actually restraining for us. It puts cages around us if we try to understand international politics by leaving aside the very concepts, the very theories, the very methodologies that we developed in all these duplicities. So once we juxtapose domestic and foreign, soft and hard issues, then we don't really understand this, complex nature of international relations. And also, lastly, we also ask, where are women in all of this? Where are we during wars? Where are we during peace? Who wrote this history? Where are the nurses? Where are the caretakers? Where are the female fighters? Where are the female soldiers? Where do we stand in the, where are the female engineers? Where are the workers who were actually producing in the, armament industry during the World War II? So, these types of questions we ask, and then we realize that, these questions, started to be asked in 1980s, but it kind of became a little bit, I don't want to say popular because, these types of questions are never popular, but more people started to be interested in these issues, especially with the end of the Cold War, because we realized that, well, with the concepts we have, we can't really understand international relations. It's not the, black and white world that the Cold War actually, was portrayed to us. So it kind of became clear that we need to find, new definitions for how the world works. And mostly female scholars, of course. I'm not saying that, all the female scholars of IR are feminists. That's not the truth. I wish they were, but they're not. But also, so we started asking these questions and try to understand, the world in a better way, which is already much more complex than those, juxtapositions that we put within the IR terms. And now it's become a little bit more interesting, I think, a little bit more interesting to the wider audience, let's say. It was always interesting to us, but it became a little bit more interesting to the wider audience, especially after the economic crisis, because, men realized that women are important and they need us somehow. So that's it. Now, a lot of people are talking about feminist foreign policy, and we can go to the more, details and nuts and bolts, of course, but, just to give you a brief description, I hope I was clear enough.
Well, very clear, but that raises a basic question for me, because you mentioned sort of objectivity as one of these traditional concepts, but isn't objectivity good? Isn't it good that we're objective? Or am I missing something here?
No, of course. It's wonderful if we are objective and rational, but this is the thing. This whole objectivity in terms of how it relates to the IR theories does not really give us the whole picture in, for example, how the decisions are made. Can you say that, Trump has been objective in his decisions, or any other world leader is objective in their decisions? All these types of prejudices that are tied to our gender roles, that women are emotional and men are not. During the last couple of years, we are seeing a lot of men cry on the bench. So apparently that's not true. So that is what I mean by, basically putting that burden of objectivity on men. But it's never the case.
And almost the illusion of objectivity, that they will be objective and rational and right. Okay, gotcha. Well, okay. So so you also mentioned power. So is it the case that we shouldn't be using the word power or using the concept of power, or that we should rethink the concept of power and how we deploy it?
of course. There are very different ways of defining power, of course.
Right.
If you only define power in terms of military strength, or in terms of how many tanks you have in your army, or only in the economic terms in terms of how many factories you have. Of course, I mean, the classical realists were already aware that that is not going to work. But you have to also keep in mind that morale of the soldiers, for example, are very important during war. Power can be defined in many different ways. There are feminist discussions of power, which are actually very much like the, very classical realists sometimes as well, in terms of, power is the ability to change someone's ideas without, making them know that they're actually changing their ideas. So it's basic diplomacy as well. So of course, we can go into the, theoretical underpinnings of many of those, but it's just, questioning all these, I would say, not only assumptions, but prejudices about, what men have and what women have.
So when Joseph Nye, of course, creates this notion of soft power, and it becomes like a buzzword for everyone in the past generation, does soft power begin to get to grips with some of the issues you're raising, or is it just another way of cloaking the traditional way we think of power in a predominantly male domain?
That's a very good question. I mean, maybe he was making way into, reconceptualization of power, just like, the feminists would do afterwards.
But, okay, well, let me go a bit further, because what strikes me is this is what I always had a problem with Nye, is he says, okay, it's soft power, but it's the power to persuade others to do what you want them to do. Mm-hmm. And that to me is not really a very engaging way of power. That you should be thinking of dialogue and partnership and cooperation. So it struck me that soft power was a little bit of that illusion that you talked about. Mm-hmm. It's still power by a few, just getting others to agree with them, right? And I assume that's not where you're coming from.
Oh, no, not at all. Of course, I'm also, I also agree with you, of course, in terms of, it's the ability to negotiate. It's the, but it's also, I mean, some of the negotiation also comes with, getting someone to do what what you want them to do as well. And, mothers are usually very good at that too. So.
Okay, all right. So that helps me out with a few of the concepts, but again, let me ask you a basic question, because it's just one that I think may be naive, but it comes to me, and that is, with a feminist foreign policy, are we being gender essential here? That a feminist foreign policy really is something that therefore involves women in positions of power, prime ministers, presidents, military positions, diplomatic positions, or can a man pursue a feminist foreign policy?
But of course they could.
Okay.
I really do not want to be, gender, an essentialist here.
Right.
And I'm not one of those, I mean, of course, we cannot put all feminists in the same, or all women, or all men in the same boxes as well. So everybody is unique, and everybody has their real, individualistic properties, way of behaving. But of course, feminist power does, feminist foreign policy does not mean that, only women can actually apply that. And I mean, I think I kind of alluded to that. Like, for example, not all the female IR scholars are actually feminists, but most feminist IR scholars are female. So it's so that's the difference. But of course, any man or any any gender can actually challenge this traditional approach to foreign policy, and the main point there is that this blindness of international relations to women, and also juxtaposition of women versus men, or all these issues, soft versus hard, all these duplicities. And it's very apparent that it doesn't work this way. The world doesn't work this way. There are more gray areas than we can ever imagine. So I mean, one thing maybe that can be said, this has been a big question in the literature as well, in terms of, for example, representation of women. And we were talking, like the more women, in the parliament, let's say, will that mean, better policies for women? Which, we don't have really any I mean, we have some support for that in research, but not enough. So it's actually more important to have some substantive representation. So women who are actually aware of women's rights, who are actually, who actually would like to fight for women's rights, who would actually put women's rights to the core of their, agenda, are the ones who are actually going to, help women in their countries. But it's not going to be, and this can be men as well. A male parliamentarian can also be the champion of women's rights, and we have, examples like this. So substantive representation, or doing this feminist work with the idea of doing a feminist work, is actually more important than actually talking about it, or just being a female saying that, oh, I'm feminist, but not really following the ethics of feminism.
That's really interesting, this question of representation, because it strikes me that you're talking about this really has to be an interaction of language and system and individual that we're talking about here. So let me test that a bit, sort of like in application. Would it be, the first women leaders that we think about, that I think there might be a Golda Meir in Israel, there might be a Margaret Thatcher here in the UK, Indira Gandhi in India. Would it be fair to say that this is not necessarily a feminist foreign policy that's implemented by these women? And if that's the case, so if that's the case, can you help us out when you might see the first breakthrough, not only in talking about a feminist foreign policy, but in terms of seeing this in application? Did it appear through a particular leader or a particular activist group, or on a particular issue? When did we first see it?
Well, of course, the first way that it started, actually, that like it came to our lexicon was in, late 2014, when Margaret Malmström, the Swedish foreign minister, said that we are going to pursue a feminist foreign policy. And everybody was like, what in the world is feminist foreign policy? So it was giving, so Sweden, for example, shaped its international aid in such a way that the international aid that it was providing was mostly going to go to projects or programs that encourage women's participation, or that would go to women's organizations. But it was not only women's organizations or women's emancipation or women's participation or anything, but also it was going to go to development projects which would actually benefit women more. So, for example, access to clean water. That's one of the problems of girls and mothers in unfortunately still most places of Africa. Or it was going to be, transportation issues. Girls could not go to school, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't, walk, really long ways to school. So these types of things. So basically what we call, mainstreaming gender policies in every type of policy. So in every type of policy, thinking with this in mind, is this beneficial for females? Is this beneficial for girls? Is this beneficial for women? Or how can this project or program can actually benefit girls and women? So, interjecting that idea, and not thinking about the community as composed only of men, would actually get us to a feminist policy. And this is actually much easier to think about in regional and local circumstances. Mm-hmm. So, for example, think about designing a park, designing a neighborhood park. And usually the care responsibility is on the mother or, daughters, or, usually the female member of the family. And imagine that a male representative in the municipality is sitting down in this big room and thinking about how to design a park. Well, he's never taken the stroller to the park. He's never taken his old father to the seaside. So he doesn't really know that, once you're pushing a wheelchair, you are actually getting through these, tough parts of the sidewalk. Because he never experienced that, or he never thought that he should push the stroller in such a way that when the park was dark. So these types of very simple things that comes from the daily life of women, just because they are the caregivers, are unfortunately not very apparent to most men. who are in the decision-making able positions. So it's just, this experience, this difference of experience that, enlightens the policy that makes that politics different.
So in other words, then the domestic and the regional and international, they intersect by providing these basic services, by working with these spaces. I see that very much in development, but how would we, before you get to development, sometimes you have to get through conflict, right? So from trying to deal with displaced persons camps, for example, in Syria, or dealing with the Yemen conflict at this point, how does a feminist foreign policy approach conflict to give us that type of space for development?
The UN Security Council has a famous resolution of which we celebrated the 20th year, and it's called 1325. So it's a Security Council resolution. So all the UN members should actually abide by it, but only 86 countries have national action plans to implement it. And the 1325 says that before conflict, during conflict, and after conflict, participation of women in the decision-making mechanisms is particularly important. So as I've given in this municipality example, the women actually experience the conflict differently. So women are usually the ones who are left behind during the war. Women are usually the ones who have to again do all the care jobs after the war. They are the ones who are stuck with the children, who has to go to school. So these types of things. So once we include women in those decision-making mechanisms, then we realize that they touch the subjects that men basically did not even think about. So it's not just this participation, of course, it's also the protection of women. I mean, conflict affects women differently. I mean, what we saw in Rwanda, Bosnia, women's bodies are sites of war. Men rape women because it's a good way of fighting. It doesn't only dehumanize the woman or messes up their whole life, but it's also a very good way of making the male soldiers basically lose all their morale that I was just talking about. So protection of women and girls during conflict is particularly important, and after conflict as well. What else? Then there is this, if there's a country in which women's rights were never the issue, or were never something that was prioritized, it's also some type of a window of opportunity. If post-conflict you can actually rebuild that place, and with the women's rights in there, then that might give us some type of benefit in terms of reforming the conflict. So that's another thing, again, that 1325 is also interested in. And lastly, it's the prevention of conflict, because sometimes boys like to fight. And we can actually, mothers and sisters and daughters and lovers usually can stop them. We have a lot of stories and history from the Greek mythology to finding different ways of doing this. But getting women into the business of also preventing conflict is also another way of incorporating women into this women, peace and security agenda. So there are different ways of participation, protection of women, getting women to the peace tables, and getting women in the prevention business are also ways in which conflicts can actually be solved. And this is true for the examples that you've given, for Yemen, for Syria. For Syria, there were women peace makers at some point in the very first mediation programs, the mediation meetings. Then women kind of disappeared.
So you mentioned the ambitions of the UN, or at least the statements of the UN. You've mentioned Sweden as a practical example in terms of implementation. Are you seeing implementation from others, either through activist groups or through particular national governments or international initiatives? Can you point us to anything else that provides a hopeful sign?
Oh, exactly. I mean, it was actually, it kind of became popular, as I said before. It's, of course, Canada took up on it, and they also wanted to do their international aid with the women's, through the women's organizations. And then there is even countries like Mexico, but what Mexico does as feminist foreign policy is actually just to increase the number of women in the foreign ministry, which is again a good thing. France and even New Zealand, I think they are also talking about feminist foreign policy. And then we do have international organizations, and that is very important. You know, NATO actually brought about their own 1325, this, you know, UN Security Council resolution, National Action Plan as 1325, and they have a special representative on 1325. The European Union has its own 1325 action plan. And you know, with the head of the commission being a woman, Ursula von der Leyen, and you know, she kind of transformed the commission as a more you know, gender equalitarian place. And so they do have, European Union now has a program, an action plan actually on how to, you know, integrate more women in this, in women, peace and security agenda, and in EU's foreign policy as well. Then we do have organizations such as the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I mean, I think all these, you know, international organizations taking up this issue is particularly important. Although, I mean, our belief in international organizations has been kindled a little bit during the last years. But then we also do have, you know, leaders are talking about this a lot. You know, we look at Joe Biden's cabinet, and now we see that there are a lot of women all around the place. So, you know, a feminist doesn't have anything but to hopeful, actually, to be hopeful, actually. So.
Well, okay, I'm going to ride with that then for one more question for our viewers, and that is, you know, as we've all gone through the pandemic in the past year, has it opened up the space for us to reconsider our use of language and the way that we present issues? In other words, out of this tragedy we've encountered, does it propel the possibility that you're thinking about in the way that we move between the domestic and the international?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it depends. Unfortunately, you know, we have seen how much it depends on the leadership. You know, we have seen very different types of leaders. We have seen, you know, formidable female leaders who were, you know, great at controlling the governing, managing the pandemic. And then we have seen, you know, male leaders who were, you know, acting very differently than most female leaders in terms of the pandemic. One of the other things that happened to, you know, women during the pandemic was that, you know, we were cooped up in our houses, and unfortunately, violence against women actually increased. There are studies on that. Since women are mostly the caregivers, you know, there are a lot of, you know, health workers who are women, so they were actually adversely affected, of course. And, you know, we had to stay home, take care of the kids, take care of the family, you know, worry about our children, and and do everything at the same time. So, I mean, there are even studies that, you know, female professors actually published less than male professors during the COVID-19. But in terms of thinking about, you know, how these lines are blurring, and how this, you know, hierarchy between the issues is dissolving, I'm not sure whether, you know, the old generation gentlemen are actually aware of this. But I'm very hopeful about the younger generation, because there's a new, you know, there's a new understanding. The world is going to be completely different, and we are not going to go back to the old ways. I think it's very clear, and I would like to believe that. So I think for the future generations, and I think there's much more interest in gender. There's much more awareness in terms of sharing the work, sharing the care work at home. I think, like, we are going to think more about collaborating with each other, which, you know, COVID clearly showed us that there's no other way of dealing with these issues.
Thank you. I could go on and on, but we'll treat this as an introduction. I mean, there's issues like climate change we could be talking about, exactly. Issues like education that we could be talking about. But I'm going to ask you if you would come back and rejoin me on World Unfiltered in a few months' time to see how we're doing, both in terms of education on what a feminist foreign policy is, but then let's talk about these issues in a bit more detail. Would you be willing to do that?
Oh, definitely. With pleasure. Thank you.
Professor Zeynep Alemdar, thank you so much. Thanks to you, the viewers of World Unfiltered. A reminder, you can always keep track of us on Deep Dive Politics with our various initiatives, including a forthcoming one that will intersect with this, which is a new program called Women in Politics. Stay tuned, but for right now, stay safe, stay sane. Take care.